Hello everyone, Mr. McKeever here, and today we're going to talk about imperialism again. As you can probably guess at this point, imperialism is one of the larger driving political movements of European history, and it goes through various incarnations. But before we start talking about how it's changed and new aspects of it that might be different compared to prior versions of imperialism, let's take a moment and just remind you, what is imperialism? And it is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force over other countries and or territories. So, kinda been doing this for a while now. You guys kind of understand how that is. That was just a quick reminder. Let's talk about things that are changing. This period of time that we are talking about today is going to be a period that we know as New Imperialism. And it begins in the late 19th century and goes through the early 20th century. And this is going to be different than prior forms for a variety of reasons. One of the big reasons is the locations of this imperialism. Old imperialism took place around the Atlantic Ocean. It was North America, South America, the Caribbean. It was done by countries like Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France. Those were our old imperializers. And it is largely driven through the spread of Catholicism. As this is very early on in the imperialism game, most of Europe was still Catholic, and it's about spreading that faith to these new native peoples. New imperialism is different in that it is not in North America, South America, the Caribbean. It is in Africa and Asia. We no longer are going to see an institutionalized slave trade that we saw in the Atlantic slave trade. That's been outlawed by pretty much every European nation. Missionaries will still be used, but they're not the driving force, and nor are they commonly Catholic at this point. Because the nations that are involved in imperialism and new imperialist age are not going to be Catholic nations. Nations like Britain and Germany, the United States, Japan, none of those nations are Catholic predominantly. They are Protestant or, in the case of Japan, none of the above. They're going to be non-Christian faiths. So, that is going to be a very different aspect of things. This new form of imperialism is focused around something different, and that is wealth. What else we see is that colonies themselves are going to be open for more free trade as we see a growing international system develop, and science is going to play a major role in opening up areas that had never been available for colonies before. Places like the interior of Africa, places like aspects of Southeast Asia, places that because of climate or animals, disease, had kept Europeans out. Well, thanks to things like zoology, botany, medicine, that's no longer a hurdle that they have to deal with anymore. So, these are a lot of the changes that are indicative of this new era of imperialism. There's one last big one, though, and it really is vital to not only this period, but the next 150 or so years of world history. And that is the introduction of something called indirect control. But we'll get to that in a second. Alright, let's use the British Empire as our example for this new imperialist age, as they're going to be the single most important player during this period. The goal of the British Empire during this period, and that of most, if not all, other European nations, is to expand their influence to new markets. The goal is to find more people that they can sell their products to, or to obtain resources that they can use to make their products. There are other sub-factors as well. The more colonies you have, the more prestige your nation has. In some countries like Russia, the idea of expansion is used as a distraction from internal problems caused by industrialization. Or in some areas still, that idea of spreading Christianity is going to be a big piece. But again, that's a sub-factor now. It's not a driving force like it used to be for the Spanish and the Portuguese. Alright, so let's talk about free trade here. So the whole purpose of this period is to expand wealth. That really only works if colonies and nations are able to trade amongst each other. So instead of developing like a mercantile system that you saw in prior forms of imperialism, this is going to be really more open for everyone to get involved. So if you have a colony such as South Africa can trade not only with the British, but also the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, whoever wants to come there. Because the goal is to get people you can sell your product to. And this is going to usher in a new era, at least the belief is that this new international trade will help promote peace. Because a country that you trade with is a country you are less likely to go to war with. Now, unfortunately, there is going to be a country that doesn't have that benefit. They are going to be kind of victimized by this quote unquote free trade or this international system that the British and other nations are trying to employ. And that country is China. So let's talk about China. Up to this point in European history, up to this point in world history, China's kind of been really the best situated nation in the world. At 1800, China is the wealthiest nation in the world. It has the largest population. They have what seems like an inexhaustible amount of resources. They have everything you could ever want. So when Europeans go to China repeatedly, the Chinese response is, thanks, but no thanks. We have what we need. Everything that you're trying to offer is something we don't need. And this was very frustrating for the Europeans, who saw China as an incredible market to sell their stuff. But unfortunately, there was nothing that they could get from China, or nothing that they could get to China that the Chinese wanted, while the Europeans wanted a ton of stuff from China. So, how do they deal with this? Well, the British are going to come up with an interesting solution. The solution is to start dealing drugs to the Chinese. When the Chinese repeatedly deny the British attempts to trade or find items to trade other than silver and gold, they resort to pushing drugs instead. So the British are going to introduce opium to China. And this is incredibly problematic, not to say anything about the horrible morality of just selling drugs for your nation's profit, but that's clearly an issue as well. Well, not long after the British introduced opium to China, there is a massive opium epidemic throughout the country. Within 30 years of the British introducing it to the country, over 12 million Chinese citizens are addicted to the drug. And this is a problem for a variety of reasons. One, if they're addicted to the drug, that causes significant health problems. Two, if they're also addicted to the drug and not working, that's going to disrupt the Chinese economy. And the Chinese officials are very aware of this. So they repeatedly asked the British to stop. And when the British refused to, the Chinese will declare war, and that is when everything falls apart for the Chinese. This conflict, known as the Opium Wars, they are a series of conflicts between the British and the Chinese, is a disaster for the Chinese. The Chinese are, unfortunately, at least 100, if not more than 100 years behind technologically to the British by the time the wars break out. Britain has started going through industrialization at this point. Their ships are being built out of iron and early forms of steel. They are coal or steam powered, whereas the Chinese are using ships from the 1600s. China has not had a significant rival to have to defend itself against since the fall of the Mongol influence. The Qing dynasty has been dominating things in East Asia for a few hundred years now. So it's a complete disaster. And that was not what the Chinese expected. And the resulting treaty, called the Treaty of Nanjing, is catastrophic for the Chinese. Now let's walk through some of the tenets of this treaty. One, it states that the British gain complete control of the city of Hong Kong for the next 100 years. And Hong Kong was a vital trading port in East Asia, not just for China, but for all East Asian civilizations. They only recently, in like the last 15 years, gave that back to the Chinese. They also introduced something called extraterritorial rights, stating that British citizens or European citizens, American citizens, aren't required to follow Chinese law while they're in China. And that they're not held responsible for their actions unless a European American official holds them accountable. And this is going to be a huge destabilizing factor for China. And then lastly, China is forced to pay an incredible amount of money to the British for expenses during the war. $21 million. Today, that would be a ridiculous sum of money. And it completely destabilizes China because of the efforts of the British in expanding this new imperialism to their country. And it's a bad day. This is going to be the beginning of the end of the traditional imperial Chinese society. Alright, so let's go back to this idea of direct and indirect control. Because China is going to be a place where a lot of the European nations and even the Americans start employing some of these tactics. First, and the most basic form of imperialism is the establishment of a direct colony. This is a direct control method, something that's been used now in old imperialism, and it will still be used in new imperialism as well, in places eventually like India or like Nigeria for the British, like most of West Africa for the French, French Indochina, etc. A protectorate is different, though. This is new, and this is where we start to see new forms of imperialism employed by countries. A protectorate is a territory that has its own government that is run by its own people, but is part of a larger foreign empire. An example of this would be a place like Canada during this period, or Australia, New Zealand, parts of the British Empire, but they have governments that are run by people from their country. They are then just advised and influenced. They pay taxes to the British Empire away from home. A sphere of influence is another form of indirect control. And a sphere of influence is where a nation has exclusive trading privileges over a chunk of land. And this is going to be used a lot in China. Various European and American nations will decide to carve up China into different pieces. And each different piece, another European nation had a sphere of influence over. So they had exclusive trading privileges in that area of China. Lastly, we have economic imperialism. Economic imperialism is the idea that a company can have an imperialistic influence or control over a region. A couple examples of this will be the Royal Niger Company in Nigeria, and it'll be the East India Company in India, and these areas, these bodies, will be the governments in an area and not a foreign country. So these are our different forms of control. China, we're going to see a lot of the spheres of influences. And in other countries, we see the other forms. The British and the Americans most commonly adapt indirect control. It's easier to maintain, requires less effort, less money, and for all intents and purposes, it's supposed to, in theory, encourage the native populations to learn how to develop democratic tendencies to therefore, at some point in the future, rule themselves. Places like France use direct control. Direct control is using your own people to rule over because you don't see the natives as being fit to rule themselves. And it establishes a concept that we call paternalism, where the European nation is the father looking upon their young child and trying to rule things over them because they aren't capable of doing it themselves. The French do this a lot, and they'll institute policies like assimilation, trying to change the native culture to that of their culture. Their culture, the natives, is inferior, so become like us, the French, a superior nation, a superior culture. And this is maybe not the greatest idea. People don't respond to this well. And so eventually the French develop a kind of happy medium, if you will, and develop a concept called association, where they establish that French society is still the pinnacle of society, but the native civilization at least have some merit, but they are inferior. Okay, let's use an example of this whole situation and talk about one nation in general, and that is going to be India, and how imperialism evolves in a place like India, which is by far the single most important colony Britain has. Last time we talked about India was a long time ago, and it had to do with the fact that both the French and the British were vying for control in India, and eventually the British went out due to the efforts of the British East India Company established back in the 1600s. And as the local government, the Mughal Empire, started to fade away, the British East India Company gained greater and greater control over the subcontinent. And when that happened, they created their own military force to help protect it. And that is a group of people we call the sepoys. The sepoys are native Indian people who are trained by the British and employed by the British East India Company to service their private military force. This is to help secure their efforts in obtaining resources, building those markets, all that one stuff. And as this is going on, we see India start producing tons of cash crops, things like tea and indigo, cotton and coffee, jute, and even opium, which the British then used to ship out to China. So these cash crops are great, but you can probably realize you can't consume any of these. So there's pluses and minuses to British influence here. Negatives such as limited actual food supplies is going to be a problem for a country who has one of the largest populations in the world. Positives, though, are that in order for the British to maximize their profits, they really had to do a lot to industrialize the continent, develop railroads, develop communication networks, build cities, irrigation canals, improve sanitation in cities. All these things were good for the Indian people as long as they don't starve to death from the lack of actual food. So, how does this all boil out? Well, something happens in the mid-19th century. A rumor is spread across India that the British are greasing their rifle cartridges that the sepoys use with pig fat or beef fat. And this is a problem because India is built around two religious entities, the Hindu world and the Islamic world. And in Islam, pig fat is seen as unclean. In Hinduism, cows are seen as sacred. So the use of either of these animals for a source of lubrication for guns is a terrible idea. And whether or not the idea was true or not, it didn't matter because the idea spread. And when it did spread, the sepoys revolted. They refused to fire their weapons, and they revolted against their British leaders, and they actually captured the city of Delhi in 1857, and they held it for almost an entire year before the British East India Company could appeal to the British Empire to bring down military forces to unseat this rebellion. And when they did, they decided that they needed to establish a more direct control over India, and part of that was developing a social hierarchy. The Hindus are going to be the top of the social pyramid in India, and the Muslims are going to be the bottom of the pyramid. And this is going to lead to future problems in the country that really do still have an influence today. Well, also after the Sepoy Mutiny, we decide that Britain itself is going to take an active control over India. The company no longer can run the subcontinent itself. Economic imperialism ends, and direct control is established in 1858. And this period established by the Government in India Act is going to really change things. The British are going to hold on to India as long as possible, using people like viceroys to really manage the nation until we see the rise of a guy by the name of Gandhi in the 20th century. So this kind of shows you the effects of imperialism over various nations. We see the spheres of influence in China, we see economic imperialism and direct colonies in India, and the influence is a bit of a mixed bag, or just terrible if you're China. But this is why and how new imperialism is different than old imperialism. And this is going to help set the stage for future conflicts, not only due to imperialist efforts, but due to the rising tension that this new form of imperialism causes between the European nations. Thanks, and have a wonderful day, everybody.